Daniel wasn't the kind of man who ever expected the world to notice him. He wasn't a politician, a celebrity, or someone who ever made the headlines. He was just a single dad, living in a small apartment on the edge of the city, trying to give his little girl the kind of childhood he never had. Life had been tough on Daniel. His wife had left when their daughter Emily was only a toddler. The reasons were complicated, but at the end of it all, Daniel was left standing there with a baby in his arms and no idea how he was going to raise her alone. He worked long hours. As a construction worker, often coming home with calloused hands and aching muscles. But no matter how tired he was, the moment he opened the door and saw Emily's smile, the weight of the world seemed lighter. Every morning followed the same routine. Daniel would wake up before the sun, pack Emily's lunch, make her breakfast, and gently wake her up for school. She was 7 years old now, full of questions and energy, always talking about her favorite books, the games she played with her friends, or the little things she learned in class. Daniel loved those moments. The walk to school with her small hand tucked in his big one. It was their time, just the two of them, before the chaos of life pulled him away to work. That particular morning began like any other. Daniel ironed Emily's uniform shirt the night before, making sure she looked neat for school. Her pink backpack, the one with a small teddy keychain, was filled with her notebooks, pencils, and the lunch he had prepared. Emily sat at the table eating her toast while Daniel reminded her, like he always did, to be kind, to listen to her teacher, and to never be afraid to ask questions. For Daniel, these were not just words. They were lessons. Lessons he hoped would help his daughter grow into someone stronger, braver, and better than he ever was. He knew the world could be harsh, but he wanted Emily to believe in goodness, even when life didn't always show it. By the time they stepped out of the apartment, the city was already waking up. Cars honked in the distance, shopkeepers rolled up their shutters, and children walked in groups toward school. Daniel carried Emily's lunch bag while she skipped beside him, her pigtails bouncing. They laughed about silly things: a pigeon trying to steal a piece of bread, a dog barking at its own shadow. To anyone watching, they looked like any other father and daughter heading off to another ordinary day. But deep inside, Daniel carried silent worries. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Sometimes he had to choose between fixing the leaky faucet and paying for Emily's school shoes. He didn't have much, but he had one thing that mattered more than anything: love. That love kept him going, and it gave him the courage to face each day. As they neared the school, the street became busier. Children in uniforms, parents in a hurry, bicycles weaving through traffic. It was the usual morning rush. Daniel tightened his grip on Emily's hand, as he always did in crowded places. He wasn't just a father, he was her protector. Protecting her had become his life's mission. That morning, however, was about to remind him that sometimes fate has a way of testing the strength we didn't even know we had. Daniel noticed her first, a little girl about Emily's age, standing near the crossing. She wore the same school uniform, her backpack slightly larger than her small frame. But unlike the other children, she wasn't moving. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, staring at something Daniel couldn't see yet. "Daddy, why is she standing like that?" Emily whispered, tugging at his sleeve. Daniel turned his head, and that's when he saw it. A man, dressed in dark clothes, with his face partially covered, was moving quickly toward the girl. His steps were sharp, his hand clenched around something shiny. It took Daniel only a split second to realize what it was: a knife. For a moment the world seemed to slow down. The sound of traffic, the chatter of children, the rush of footsteps, all of it faded into the background. All Daniel could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the terrified breathing of the little girl who couldn't move. Most people would freeze in that moment. Some might run, some might scream, but Daniel didn't think. He couldn't think. All he knew was that a child who wasn't his own, but who could have been, was in danger. Without letting go of Emily's hand, he moved. "Stay behind me," he shouted, pulling his daughter close as he lunged toward the little girl. In an instant, he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her into the safety of his chest. He could feel her trembling, her small hands clutching his shirt as if he were her last hope. The man with the knife was close now, too close. Daniel's body tensed as instincts he didn't even know he had took over. He turned his back just as the knife slashed downward. Pain ripped through his shoulder, but he didn't let go. He tightened his grip on both girls, his body acting. As a shield, gasps filled the street. Parents screamed. Children cried. But Daniel stayed where he was, planting his feet firmly on the ground. He looked straight into the eyes of the man holding the knife, and without saying a word, his message was clear. You will not touch them. The man hesitated, caught off guard by the sheer courage of an ordinary father who had no weapon, no armor, and no reason to fight except love. And in that hesitation, others stepped in. A shopkeeper rushed forward. Another parent shouted for help, and within seconds, more people surrounded the attacker, forcing him to retreat. The danger passed as quickly as it had appeared, but the moment left its mark. Daniel staggered, the pain in his shoulder burning, but he refused to let go of the girls. Emily was crying now, her face buried against him. The other girl, still in shock, clung to his side. Daniel knelt down slowly, his voice gentle, despite the pain. You're safe now, he whispered to the girl. No one's going to hurt you. I promise. That night, after the police had taken statements and the attacker had been caught, Daniel returned home with Emily. His shirt was torn and blood-stained, his shoulder bandaged. Emily stayed close to him, refusing to leave his side even for a moment. Daddy, she said softly as he tucked her into bed, you were like a superhero today. Daniel smiled weakly. No, sweetheart, I'm not a superhero, just a dad who loves his daughter, and who couldn't let any child get hurt. She hugged him tightly, whispering, I'm proud of you. And in that quiet moment, Daniel realized something. He didn't need medals or recognition. He didn't need the world to know his name. What mattered most was that his daughter saw him for who he truly was, a father who would give everything to protect the innocent. As he lay in bed later that night, exhausted and in pain, Daniel had no idea that the events of that morning were far from over. Because the little girl he had saved wasn't just any child. And the very next morning, someone very important would be knocking on his door. Asterisk, the city streets always had a rhythm in the morning footsteps. Chatter, the low hum of engines rolling toward the day's routine. For most people it was just another ordinary start, but for Daniel, every morning felt like a balancing act. With Emily's small hand tucked in his, he carried the weight of fatherhood, work, and survival all at once. His mind often drifted to the bills he hadn't paid. Yet the repairs the apartment desperately needed, or the way his body ached after long hours on the construction site. But he never let Emily see those worries, smiled, laughed at her jokes, and listened carefully when she spoke. He knew she deserved a father who made her feel safe, even when the world wasn't. That morning seemed no different. Daniel was focused on walking Emily to school. She skipped beside him, humming a little tune, her pink backpack bouncing. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Children in uniforms clustered together in groups, trading stories about homework or playground games. Daniel always felt a quiet sense of relief in those moments, seeing kids being kids. Despite his struggles, at least Emily was growing up in an environment where she could still laugh freely, dream openly, and run toward the future without fear. But just as they turned a corner near the school gates, Daniel noticed something unusual. The flow of people on the sidewalk slowed. A hush fell over a small section of the crowd. It wasn't the normal morning buzz anymore. It was tension, sharp and sudden, like air before a storm. Daniel's eyes sharpened, instinct telling him something was wrong. That's when he saw her. A little girl, about the same age as Emily, stood alone near the curb. She wasn't talking, wasn't moving, just stared with wide, terrified eyes at a man approaching far too quickly. His face was covered, his clothes dark, and in his gloved hand gleamed something that made Daniel's stomach drop. A knife dot. That instant, Daniel's world shrank to one choice. He didn't think about himself, his pain, or even what might happen next. He thought only of the girl, someone's daughter. Someone's whole world standing frozen in fear with danger seconds away. Without a word, Daniel acted. He pulled Emily closer with one arm and lunged forward with the other, sweeping the girl into his chest. His body moved on instinct, fueled by something deeper than reason, pure, unshakable love for children. His own and every child who reminded him of her. The man with the knife was fast, but Daniel was faster. He twisted, shielding the girls, and felt a hot sting tear across his shoulder. Pain exploded, but he didn't let go. He crouched low, wrapping both children in his arms, his body forming a barrier between innocence and violence. Gasps filled the air as parents and bystanders realized what was happening. For a few long seconds, time stood still. The masked man towered over him, knife glinting, but Daniel's eyes never flinched. They were steady, fierce, carrying a message louder than words. You will not harm them, not while I breathe. That defiance made the attacker falter. And in that tiny hesitation, others found their courage. A nearby shopkeeper shouted, rushing forward. Another parent yelled for help. Within moments, more people closed in, shouting, throwing whatever they could, forcing the attacker to back away. The threat retreated as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the crowd and sirens that began wailing in the distance. Daniel's body shook from the adrenaline. His shoulder burned, blood soaking through his shirt, but his arms remained locked. Around the girls, Emily sobbed against him, her little hands clutching his side. The other girl trembled, too shocked to speak. Slowly, Daniel loosened his grip, kneeling so he could look into her eyes. His voice, though hoarse with pain, was calm and gentle. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you, I promise. The girl's lips trembled as she whispered, thank you. When the police arrived minutes later, chaos unfolded. Questions, statements, flashing lights. The attacker was caught a few blocks away, but Daniel barely heard the details. He was too focused on making sure the girls were calm that Emily felt safe. That the other child had someone holding her hand until her guardian arrived. He refused to leave until he was sure both were okay. That night, Daniel sat at the edge of his small bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft breathing of Emily asleep in the next room. The pain was sharp, but the memory of the little girl's terrified eyes cut even deeper. He couldn't stop replaying the moment, her frozen figure, the knife, the split-second decision. What haunted him wasn't the danger he faced, but the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't stepped in. Emily had refused to leave his side all evening. At dinner, she reached across the table, holding his hand tightly. Daddy, she said softly, you were like a superhero today. Daniel gave her a tired smile. No, sweetheart. I'm not a superhero. I'm just a dad who did what any dad would do. But Emily shook her head firmly. Oh, you're my hero. And you're hers too. Her words struck something deep inside him. He had always worried that being a single dad, struggling to provide, meant he wasn't enough. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he was. As he finally lay down to rest, exhaustion pulling at him, Daniel thought the ordeal was over. He believed tomorrow would bring nothing more than work, bills, and the quiet routine of his life. What he didn't know was that the little girl he had saved wasn't just any child. And by the next morning, his simple apartment door would open to someone powerful. Someone whose gratitude would change the course of his life forever. The night after the attack felt endless for Daniel. His small apartment, usually filled with the soft laughter of his daughter, was now quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of his own breathing as he sat on the couch, shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages. The pain throbbed with every movement, but he tried not to show it. Emily, curled up beside him with her favorite blanket, looked at him with wide, worried eyes. He stroked her hair gently and whispered that everything was fine, that Daddy was strong and nothing could ever hurt him too badly. Deep inside, though, Daniel knew he had come close to something that could have changed everything. But he also knew he wouldn't have acted any differently. He would have taken that risk again 1,000 times over if it meant protecting a child. The city outside continued with its noise, cars rushing by, voices echoing from the street below, but inside Daniel's home, the atmosphere was heavy. thought about the little girl he had shielded, how small she had felt in his arms, how she had clung to him as if she knew somehow that this stranger was willing to protect her no matter the cost. Her face lingered in his memory, pale and frozen in fear, until she realized she was safe. He thought about how fragile life was, how moments could change everything in an instant. Daniel had always seen himself as an ordinary man, nothing special. A single dad trying to get by, working hard to keep a roof over his daughter's head, making sure she had shoes that fit, and that she never felt unloved even if they couldn't afford everything other kids had. But now, as he replayed the day in his mind, he realized he had stepped into a moment that was anything but ordinary. He hadn't planned it, he hadn't trained for it, but he had acted. That thought both humbled him and unsettled him. Later, that night, when Emily had finally drifted to sleep, Daniel sat alone at the table, staring at his calloused hands. His shoulder hurt badly, but what weighed heavier was the realization of what could have happened. If he had been slower, if he had hesitated, the story would have ended differently. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks, not for himself but for the children, that they were unharmed, that their laughter would continue another day, when morning came. Daniel rose early, as he always did, though every muscle in his body begged him to rest. He made breakfast for Emily, wincing as he lifted the pan, but he forced a smile when she looked at him. He didn't want her to carry fear. Children deserved to believe the world was still good, even if it wasn't always true. As they sat together, at the small table, Emily studied him with quiet admiration. She was still too young to understand the weight of what had happened. But she knew her father had done something brave, something that mattered. On their walk to school that morning, Daniel felt eyes on him. Neighbors who had heard whispers of the incident looked at him differently now. Some nodded with respect, some murmured quietly, but Daniel kept his focus on Emily. He didn't want recognition. He wasn't looking for applause. His only concern was his daughter's hand in his, her safety, her future. Still, word of what had happened was spreading. Parents at the school gate talked in hushed tones, retelling the story as if it were something out of a movie. They spoke of the single father who had thrown himself between a knife and a child he didn't even know, who had bled for someone else's daughter. To them it sounded heroic, almost unbelievable. To Daniel, it had simply been the only thing he could do. He didn't see it as heroism, just instinct, just love. But what Daniel didn't know was that the little girl he had saved was no ordinary child. Her mother was someone who carried weight in the city, someone whose voice reached thousands, someone who lived in a world far removed from Daniel's modest apartment and construction site paychecks. And while Daniel went about his morning, unaware, that mother was making plans to find the man who had saved her daughter's life. Back at the apartment later that day, Daniel tried to keep things normal. He fixed the leaky faucet, helped Emily with her homework, and prepared dinner. Yet, even as he stirred the pot on the stove, he felt a lingering heaviness in his chest. He didn't want the attention, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him had shifted. Something had changed in those few seconds on the street. Something that would follow him now, whether he asked for it or not. He remembered the attacker's eyes, cold and determined, and for a moment he wondered why. Why had that man targeted a little girl? What darkness drove him? Daniel knew he would probably never have the answer. But he also knew that evil in the world could only be confronted by people willing to stand up, people willing to act. And he had acted. That realization gave him a quiet sense of peace, even amidst the pain that night. As Emily fell asleep with her head resting against his uninjured arm, Daniel whispered softly, more to himself than to her, "If being a father means carrying the hurt so you don't have to, then I'll carry it all. Every time." It was a vow he had made years ago when Emily's mother walked away. It was a vow he renewed every single day without thinking. But now, after the events of that morning, it felt heavier, deeper, almost sacred. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this: his love for his daughter, and his willingness to protect the innocent would never waver. And as he drifted off to sleep, exhausted and sore, he couldn't possibly imagine that tomorrow morning someone powerful, someone unexpected, would knock on his door. The story wasn't finished. In fact, it had only just begun. The night after the attack was one of the longest nights Daniel could remember. The moment he and Emily closed the door of their little apartment, the weight of the day came crashing down on him. His shoulder. Burned with every movement, the bandage wrapped tightly but still damp with blood, yet he forced himself to keep steady. Emily's small eyes kept darting toward him, filled with worry. She didn't say much at first, just followed him around the apartment as if she was afraid that if she let him out of her sight, something bad would happen again. Daniel pretended to be fine, putting on a brave face, but inside he felt the exhaustion clawing at him. He had given so much of himself that morning, and now the pain was demanding its due. Still, he couldn't let Emily see that. He guided her to the table and made her a simple dinner, even though every movement sent sharp stings through his arm. Emily watched him quietly, her fork untouched as she studied his face. At last she whispered, "Daddy, does it hurt a lot?" Daniel paused, then gave her a gentle smile. "It's nothing I can't handle. You don't need to worry about me, sweetheart. Daddy's strong." But Emily didn't look convinced. She slid from her chair and came over to sit beside him, resting her small head against his arm, careful not to touch the injured shoulder. In that moment, Daniel realized how much she understood, even without words. Children always saw more than adults believed they did. Later, after dinner, Daniel helped her get ready for bed. She refused to let go of his hand as he tucked her in. She looked up at him with teary eyes and whispered, "I was scared today, Daddy. But then I saw you stand in front of us, and I wasn't scared anymore." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He brushed her hair gently and said, "That's my job, Emily, to keep you safe, no matter what. You're the most important thing in my life." She hugged him fiercely before drifting off to sleep, and Daniel sat there for a long time, watching her breathe peacefully. In that stillness, he realized that while his body might ache, his heart felt stronger than ever. When the apartment finally grew silent, Daniel sat alone on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in his mind: the glint of the knife, the terror in the little girl's eyes, the searing pain as the blade cut into him. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. Fear could have paralyzed him in that moment, but love had propelled him forward instead. He thought of all the parents who might not have been there in time, of all the children who needed someone to step in for them. The weight of that thought sat heavily on him. He wondered if he would always be enough, if his strength could carry him through every storm. Sleep came in restless waves. The pain in his shoulder made it hard to rest, but what truly kept him awake were the questions. What if he hadn't been fast enough? What if his daughter had been the one standing frozen that day? The thought was unbearable. He whispered prayers in the dark, not for himself, but for every child who needed protection, and for the strength to keep going no matter how hard it got. The morning light eventually spilled through the thin curtains, and with it came the familiar sounds of the city waking up. Daniel dragged himself from bed, his body heavy with fatigue. He could have easily stayed home to recover, but that wasn't an option in his mind. Emily needed breakfast. She needed routine. She needed to feel that the world was still steady, even after what had happened. So, he moved slowly but purposefully through the kitchen, making eggs and toast, his left hand doing most of the work while his right arm hung carefully at his side. Emily appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, holding her stuffed bear. She climbed onto the chair and looked at him with sleepy eyes. "You're really going to work today?" she asked softly. Daniel set the plate in front of her and nodded. "It's what we do, Emily. We keep moving forward. We don't let fear stop us from living." She watched him for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if she understood more than her years allowed. When they left for school, Daniel felt the stares of neighbors again. People whispered as he passed by, nodding with respect, some offering words of gratitude for what he had done. He acknowledged them politely, but didn't linger. He wasn't looking for admiration. He didn't think of himself as a hero. In his mind, he had simply done what any decent person should to protect the innocent. But the truth was, not everyone would have done what he did. Many people would have frozen, and he would have stepped back, waiting for someone else to act. Daniel didn't judge them for that, but he knew why he couldn't be one of them. For him, life had always been about one thing: being there for Emily. That instinct had extended to the little girl in danger as naturally as breathing. He hadn't thought of consequences. He hadn't thought of his own safety. His only thought had been that a child needed protecting. The day passed in a blur of work and pain. Every hammer he lifted, every movement he made sent jolts through his injured shoulder. But Daniel pushed on, because bills didn't wait for wounds to heal. He knew he had to keep going, not just for himself, but for Emily. He came home that evening exhausted, body aching more than ever, but when Emily ran into his arms, all the weariness faded for a moment. Her smile, her laughter, was enough to remind him why he endured everything. That night, as he read her a bedtime story, Emily asked, "Daddy, would you always do that for me, even if it was dangerous?" Daniel looked at her, his heart swelling with love, and replied softly, "Always, sweetheart, always. There's nothing in this world that could stop me from protecting you." She hugged him tightly, and in her embrace, he felt a strength greater than any medicine could give. As he lay in bed later, his body sore and his mind heavy, Daniel thought about the road ahead. He didn't know that fate was already weaving something unexpected, that the little girl he had saved would soon bring a knock on his door that would change everything. All he knew in that moment was that he had faced fear and chosen love, and that choice gave him the strength to keep moving forward. It was a night of pain, yes, but it was also a night that reminded him of who he truly was, a father whose strength came not from muscles or weapons, but from love so deep it could not be broken. The morning after the attack began, like many others in Daniel's small apartment, though nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. The air seemed heavier, the silence sharper, and even as he moved through the kitchen, making breakfast with one good arm, he felt a strange tension he couldn't quite explain. The wound on his shoulder still ached, every small motion reminding him of the sacrifice he had made less than 24 hours earlier. But despite the pain, he forced himself to move, to smile for Emily, to keep things as normal as possible. He had always believed children deserved stability, no matter how chaotic the world became around them. Emily sat at the table, swinging her legs beneath her chair, her stuffed bear propped beside her plate. She looked at him with eyes that still carried yesterday's worry, though she tried to hide it behind a small smile. "Daddy," she said softly, "you don't have to go to work today, do you? Maybe you should rest." Daniel chuckled under his breath, setting her breakfast down in front of her. "Rest doesn't put food on the table, sweetheart. Don't worry, I'll take it easy, I promise." He ruffled her hair with his good hand, hiding the way his body screamed in protest at even that small movement as they ate. Daniel's mind wandered. He thought about the girl he had shielded, wondering if she had slept peacefully that night, or if the memory of the knife haunted her dreams. He hoped she was safe, comforted in her mother's arms, reminded that the world still held kindness. He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her except that she was about Emily's age, with wide, frightened eyes that would stay with him forever. He thought about her and prayed silently that she never again had to feel that kind of fear. Once breakfast was finished, Daniel helped Emily into her school uniform. She held his hand tightly as they stepped out of the apartment, and he noticed how much closer she stayed to him than before. Normally, she skipped ahead or pointed excitedly at little things on the street, but today she stayed glued to his side, her grip never loosening. He realized the attack had affected her too. His heart ached, knowing that innocence had been chipped away from her young world. They reached the school gates. Daniel crouched down carefully, despite the pull on his shoulder. He kissed Emily's forehead and whispered, "Be brave, my little one. I'll be right here at the end of the day, waiting for you." She nodded and hurried inside, glancing back once before disappearing into the crowd of children. Daniel stood there for a moment longer than usual, watching until she was out of sight. Then, with a sigh, he turned back toward home. He didn't feel ready for work, not with the pain still gnawing at him, but he knew he couldn't afford to miss too many days. Every hour on the construction site mattered. Every paycheck mattered. That was the reality of his life. When he reached his apartment, he sank into the old couch, closing his eyes. Just for a moment, he told himself. Just a few minutes to rest before heading out. But then came a knock on the door. A firm, deliberate knock that made his eyes snap open. Daniel frowned. Visitors were rare in his life. He didn't have much family nearby, and neighbors usually minded their own business. He pushed himself up, wincing as his shoulder protested, and shuffled toward the door. When he opened it, he froze. Standing there was the little girl he had saved. She looked different without the fear distorting her face. But he recognized her instantly, the same eyes, the same small frame now tucked behind the leg of the woman beside her. And the woman. She wasn't someone Daniel expected to ever see outside his door. She was dressed neatly in a tailored coat, her posture commanding, her face instantly recognizable from news channels and campaign posters across the city. She was a politician, well-known, respected, often seen giving speeches about change and progress. Yet here she was, standing on the worn welcome mat of his modest apartment. For a long moment, Daniel just stared, unsure of what to say. The woman broke the silence first. Her voice was firm but carried an unusual softness. "You must be Daniel." He cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am." "Are?" He already knew, of course, but it felt surreal to speak her name aloud. She smiled faintly, though her eyes held more emotion than her expression revealed. "I'm Margaret. This is my daughter, Lily. She's the one you saved yesterday." Lily peeked out from behind her mother, clutching her coat. When her eyes met Daniel's, she whispered softly, "Thank you." The simplicity of those two words nearly undid him. He knelt carefully despite the pain, bringing himself to her level. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "Safe. That's all that matters." Margaret's gaze softened as she watched the exchange. After a moment, she cleared her throat and said, "May we come in?" Daniel hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. The apartment was small, modest, its furniture worn from years of use. He suddenly felt self-conscious, aware of how different their worlds were. She lived in power and influence, and he lived paycheck to paycheck trying to keep the lights on. But Margaret didn't seem to notice the cracks in the walls or the old sofa. Her focus was entirely on him. Once inside, she turned to him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "I don't know how to properly thank you," she said. "Not you put yourself in harm's way for my daughter. You bled for her. And you didn't even know her name." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. "I just did what anyone would have done," but Margaret shook her head firmly. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have frozen, or run, or called for help and waited. But you didn't. You acted. You risked everything for a child who wasn't yours." Her words made Daniel's chest tighten. He didn't think of himself as special, but hearing it framed that way made him realize how rare such actions were. He looked down, suddenly embarrassed. "I didn't think about it. I couldn't let her get hurt." Silence filled the room for a moment before Margaret spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You reminded me of something important yesterday. Something I had forgotten in all the noise of politics and speeches. You reminded me that real courage doesn't come from power or titles. It comes from love, from humanity." Daniel met her eyes then, and for the first time, he saw not the politician, but a mother grateful. Humbled and deeply moved, Lily tugged at her mother's sleeve, then turned to Daniel. "Can we visit again?" she asked shyly. Daniel smiled warmly. "Of course, you're always welcome here." Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, then looked back at Daniel. "You may think you're just an ordinary man, but to us, you're so much more. You've changed something in me, and I promise you, the world is going to know what you did." Daniel didn't know how to reply. He wasn't looking for recognition, but he could feel the sincerity in her words. And for the first time since the attack, he realized that maybe his act of selflessness had a ripple effect far beyond what he could see. As they left his apartment that morning, Daniel stood at the doorway, watching them walk down the hall. Felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, humility, and uncertainty about what would come next. All he knew was that yesterday he had acted out of instinct, and today, that act had brought unexpected visitors who might just change his life forever. Asterisk when Daniel closed the door after Margaret and Lily left. The small apartment felt strangely different. It was the same old space with peeling paint on the walls and furniture that had seen better days. But it carried a weight now, almost as if the air itself had been changed by their visit. Daniel sat back down on the couch, his good hand pressed against his forehead, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had expected nothing after yesterday, no thanks, no recognition, not even a second thought from the world at large. In his mind, he had just done what had to be done. But now, a woman of influence, someone who lived in a world so far removed from his own, had stood in his home and told him that his actions had reminded her of what really mattered. The thought unsettled him, not because he disliked it, but because it felt bigger than him. Daniel was used to keeping his life small. His focus had always been on Emily getting her to school on time, putting food on the table, saving whatever pennies he could for her future. He wasn't someone who thought about politics or speeches. He didn't think about change on a large scale. His life revolved around the basics: work hard, love his daughter, protect her from harm. But now, because of one moment of instinct, his path had crossed with someone who shaped laws and decisions, someone whose voice reached thousands of people. It felt like two different worlds colliding. He wasn't sure he was ready for what that meant. As the day went on, Daniel tried to keep busy. He cleaned up the kitchen, folded laundry, and checked on the bandages on his shoulder. The pain was manageable if he didn't move too much. But every time he lifted his arm, the sting reminded him of what he had sacrificed. He looked at the set wound in the mirror and shook his head. He had never thought of himself as strong or brave. He was just a man who had stepped in when someone needed him. Yet when Margaret spoke to him earlier, it was as if she saw something more in him. Something he wasn't sure even existed. That evening, Emily came home from school, full of chatter about her day. She talked about art class, about the story her teacher had read, about the new game she and her friends played at recess. Daniel listened with a smile, grateful for the normalcy her words brought. But when she paused and asked suddenly, "Daddy, who was that lady this morning?" he knew he couldn't avoid the truth. "She was the mother of the girl I helped yesterday," Daniel explained gently. "She wanted to thank me." Emily tilted her head, her eyes curious. But why was she so important? "Everyone at school said she's a big politician." Daniel chuckled softly. "She is. She makes decisions for the city, gives speeches, helps make laws. She's someone a lot of people listen to." Emily frowned thoughtfully. "And she came here? To see us?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. Because even people in big positions are still just parents when it comes to their children. She wanted to thank me for keeping her daughter safe." Emily's small smile grew slowly. "Then I think she saw what I see every day. That you're the bravest person I know." Her words touched him deeply, and Daniel hugged her carefully, mindful of his shoulder. "I'm just your dad," he whispered. But inside, he wondered if maybe Emily was right. The next few days passed with an unusual sense of attention surrounding him. Neighbors stopped him in the hallway to offer words of respect. People at the local market nodded in recognition, whispering about him as he passed. Daniel didn't crave attention, and in truth, it made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to be the center of stories or rumors, or he couldn't deny the shift. People were beginning to look at him differently. Then came the invitation. Formal envelope arrived, slipped under his door, bearing the seal of the city. Inside was a letter, neatly typed, inviting him to a public event where Margaret would be speaking. The letter explained that she wanted to acknowledge him publicly, to honor his courage in front of the community. Daniel stared at the letter for a long time, conflicted. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to stay in the shadows of his quiet life. He didn't want cameras flashing in his face, didn't want to stand in front of a crowd. But another part of him thought about Emily, about the message she would take from it if he stood tall, not just for her, but for others. Maybe it wasn't about recognition for himself. Maybe it was about showing her that doing the right thing always mattered, even if it meant standing in uncomfortable places. The day of the event arrived faster than he expected. Daniel put on his cleanest shirt, though it was far from new, and Emily insisted on brushing his hair just right. She looked at him with pride shining in her eyes, and that alone gave him the courage he needed. Together, they walked to the community hall, where the event was being held. Inside, the room buzzed with people reporters, with cameras, families from the neighborhood, city officials. Daniel felt out of place immediately, his rough hands and worn shoes a sharp contrast to the polished appearance of those around him. But when Margaret stepped onto the stage and began to speak, all eyes shifted to her, and Daniel found a small pocket of relief. She spoke about the challenges the city faced, about laws and policies, but then her tone changed. Her voice grew more personal, more heartfelt. She told the story of a morning when her daughter's life had been in danger, when fear had frozen her in place, and how an ordinary man had stepped forward without hesitation. She spoke of Daniel not just as a rescuer, but as a symbol of what true courage looked like. She said it wasn't titles or power that defined a hero, but the willingness to act for others without expecting anything in return. As she spoke, people turned to look at Daniel. He felt his cheeks flush, his body tense, but Emily squeezed his hand tightly. He looked down at her, saw the pride in her eyes, and suddenly he wasn't afraid of the attention anymore. If this moment would shape how she saw the world, then it was worth it. When Margaret asked him to join her on stage, Daniel hesitated only briefly before standing. The room erupted in applause as he walked forward, his steps steady, despite the weight of the moment. He stood beside her, humbled, uncomfortable, yet strangely at peace. Margaret looked at him and said softly into the microphone, "This man reminded me and should remind all of us that true leadership begins with humanity, that our children's safety, their future, is the most important thing we can protect. He may not see himself as a hero, but today I want the world to see him as one." The crowd rose to their feet, clapping, cheering. Daniel's eyes watered, not because of the recognition, but because in the front row, Emily clapped the hardest, her face glowing with pride. In that moment, Daniel realized something profound. His world and Margaret's were indeed different, one of power and influence, the other of quiet struggle, but they had collided for a reason. His act of selflessness had bridged that gap, reminding both of them of what truly mattered. And though he still didn't care for titles or applause, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Maybe his life wasn't meant to stay small. Maybe his courage, born from love for his daughter, could ripple outward and touch more lives than he'd ever imagined. Asterix's life has a strange way of turning ordinary people into symbols. And Daniel never imagined his quiet, humble existence would become something others would talk about. He was used to being unnoticed, the man on the construction site, who worked long hours and went home tired. The father who packed lunches and ironed shirts, the neighbor who nodded politely but rarely spoke. That was the life he knew, the life he expected to continue living. But ever since that morning when he stepped in front of a knife to protect a little girl, nothing had been the same. The world had shifted, and so had he. In the days that followed the public event, the story spread further than Daniel could have imagined. Newspapers printed headlines calling him a hero. Reporters wrote about his selflessness. His face appeared on television screens, even though he had never sought such attention. Strangers stopped him on the street, shaking his hand, thanking him for what he had done. Parents pointed him out to their children as an example of bravery. And though Daniel still felt uncomfortable with the spotlight, he began to realize that maybe this attention wasn't about him at all. It was about the message his actions carried. For Emily, the changes were even more profound. At school, her classmates looked at her differently. Teachers praised her father openly. She held her head a little higher, no longer embarrassed about their modest life or the fact that she didn't have the newest shoes or gadgets. She had something more important now, a father whose courage was known to everyone. She would tell anyone who asked, with pride shining in her eyes, "My dad's not just my hero, he's everyone's hero." Margaret, too, kept her word. She spoke Daniel's name whenever she addressed the public, not to elevate him for fame's sake, but to remind people of the lessons she herself had learned. She admitted openly that in politics it was easy to forget the human side of leadership, easy to get lost in numbers and debates. But Daniel had reminded her that at the heart of everything were people, voluntary people willing to do extraordinary things for love and kindness. She began to change her speeches, her policies, even the way she interacted with those who came to her for help. She often said, "Leadership is not about standing above others. It is about standing in front of them when danger comes." Daniel watched all of this unfold with quiet disbelief. He still went to work each morning, still walked Emily to school, still came home to their small apartment. He hadn't suddenly become rich or powerful. His shoulder healed slowly, leaving a scar that would stay with him, but life in many ways carried on as before. Yet he could feel the ripple effect of his actions. The neighborhood felt closer, kinder. People greeted one another with a little more warmth. Parents held their children a little tighter. And Daniel realized that sometimes one act of courage could awaken something greater in a whole community. One evening, months later, Daniel sat with Emily on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. She leaned against him, her voice thoughtful. "Daddy, do you think people will remember what you did, or will they forget one day?" Daniel wrapped an arm around her gently, choosing his words with care. "Sweetheart, it doesn't matter if they remember me. What matters is if they remember the lesson. That even ordinary people can do extraordinary things. When they choose love over fear, if people carry that with them, then that's enough." Emily nodded slowly, processing his words. Then she smiled. "I'll never forget. And one day, if I see someone who needs help, I'll be brave too. It's just like you." Those words filled Daniel's heart with more pride than any applause ever could. In that moment, he understood the true legacy of his actions. It wasn't about medals, recognition, or news stories. It was about the next generation, about planting seeds of courage and kindness in his daughter and others like her. It was about reminding the world that strength doesn't always come from power, it comes from love. Time moved forward, as it always does, but the memory of that day lingered in the city's collective heart. People would tell the story of the single dad who threw himself in front of danger for a child he didn't even know. It's the man who bled but stood firm. It's the man who showed that being a hero wasn't about perfection or status, it was about choice. And for Daniel, life remained beautifully simple. He continued to wake before dawn, make breakfast, and walk Emily to school. He continued to work long hours, his hands rough and calloused, his body tired but his spirit strong. He continued to live not for recognition but for love. And that, in the end, was his greatest strength. Because true courage doesn't fade when the applause stops. True courage lives on in the quiet moments. The father who holds his daughter's hand a little tighter. The neighbor who looks out for another. The stranger who steps forward when others step back. Daniel's legacy wasn't written in newspapers or carved into monuments. It was written in the hearts of those who heard his story and decided to live a little braver, love a little deeper, and protect the innocent without hesitation. Years later, Emily would grow up and tell her own children about her father. She would describe the morning when he shielded not just her, but another little girl, the day when he proved that ordinary men could do extraordinary things. Now, those children would grow up with that story as part of their inheritance. A reminder that kindness and courage are the most powerful gifts anyone can give. As for Daniel, he never stopped being who he always was, a father, a protector, a man who lived quietly but loved fiercely. His scar remained a permanent mark on his body, but he wore it with pride. Not because it made him look strong, but because it reminded him of the day love was stronger than fear. And so the story of the single dad who took a knife for a schoolgirl became more than just a headline. It became a legacy, a timeless reminder. That sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask to be called heroes at all. They are the ones who simply choose love, again and again, no matter the cost.